Good afternoon, everybody. Hopefully, we are streaming live. Welcome to this very special webinar on the just published and very important book. You can have a look at it here, Behind Prison Walls. And it's pulled together by Justice, former Constitutional Court Justice and current Inspecting Judge of Prisons, Edwin Cameron. Welcome. Always fantastic to have you around. Rebecca Gore will delve deeper into your role in this book. And Sohela Sorajpal, thank you also for being part of the discussion this afternoon. The book is available at the Daily Maverick Bookshop, should you want to purchase it. So welcome, everybody. Just to begin with, I wanted to say that many great South African leaders actually were groomed and came through South Africa's jails. We have to bear that in mind. Some for the better and some for the worst. And actually, Mandela is our most, obvious one to speak about, but Justice Cameron himself is an old jailbird, and maybe he can tell us about that. And he's had family who's had to experience incarceration, so that's really amazing. I was also just saying before we went on air, sometimes South Africa brings around the right person for the right job at the right time, who knows everything that he should know. And there we have this man sitting, human rights lawyer, and with various others, bows in his arrow. So there are 243 prisons in South Africa, and it's the largest prison population in South Africa. Most of this is just hiding in plain sight. We know they're there. We don't care. It's there. People must get punished. And Edwin writes this very powerfully. He says, like abattoirs, they're not designed to be open and transparent. And that was such a powerful way of talking about incarceration, punishment, prisons in a society as violent and lawless as South Africa. So here to shine a very harsh light on this is the book and the three authors together. Welcome again, as I say, Inspecting Judge of Prisons, Edwin Cameron. Let's start with you. As I said, you couldn't be a better suited individual for this role. Give us a little bit of background about your own personal experience with the law as a judge and then as a young activist prior to all of that.
Marianne, absolutely delighted to be on Daily Maverick's webinar and delighted to be with my two co-authors who wrote most of the book. We'll get to that in due course. And my name is at the front because C comes before G and S. Marianne, let me tell you that when I was very young, I was in a children's home and I realized that my father was in jail for car theft. So that imprinted it at a very early impressionable stage. And then when I did vacation duty with a judge in the old Supreme Court in the winter of 1976, I visited Vereeniging prison, and we talked there about the huge assembly of black women who were in jail under Connie Mulder's minimum sentence laws for dacha, which for centuries. So that made a profound impression on me, the visit to Vereeniging Jail, as we explained in our first chapter. And then, of course, the job where I was very fortunate to be joined both by Rebecca and then successively by Sohela. We worked together. They were my research associates. And the book is the product, but they will tell you more about that. It's been a privilege for the last 6 years. I'm very happy on this webinar to say that the President on Friday gazetted the appointment of my successor, Judge Lee Bozalek, who was formerly head of the LRC in Cape Town, a long service as a public pro bono, a public interest lawyer, and he takes over after many years of service on the Cape High Court on the 1st of January next year. And I hope he's as lucky as I was to work with two extraordinary people as I did in Rebecca and Sohela.
And hopefully also he enters an arena where the legislation gives the more teeth to law. Please, either Rebecca or anybody else fall in where you need to. Both of you have worked extensively sort of as law, in the judiciary around people like Edwin, work on this expose, because that's what it is. It's much deeper than just a story in a newspaper or a shocking thing that appears. This is an in-depth look at, as you say, the word is haunting. It's absolutely haunting South Africa's prisoners. I'm not sure which one of you would like to jump in with is why and whether this is something you're going to commit yourselves to going forward.
Mm-hmm. Well, Rebecca and I both worked with Justice Cameron at JICS, which is our country's prisons inspectorate. And really, the work of JICS is to do exactly what you've described, to shine a light on prisons. JICS does inspections of prisons. It conducts investigations into deaths, into assault, into allegations of torture or sexual violence or corruption. And it does this work as a sort of Mandela era innovation, an attempt after our apartheid past to do better, to make sure that our prisons weren't places of abuse and human rights violations. We will probably speak about this more. We don't always feel that we've been successful. JICS has a hard battle to fight, but that's where Rebecca and I came to work with Justice Cameron. Justice Cameron headed JICS, he still heads JICS as inspecting judge. And we had this unique experience at JICS that most people, including most lawyers, will never have, which is exposure to what prisons actually look like and what a life in prison means. We gathered wonderful resources. We got to meet wonderful people. We started to learn about all the reforms that really are possible and doable and could make meaningful differences in prisons. But we realized that this wasn't information that a lot of people had access to. And that's why we wrote the book. We said we want, as all of us leave JICS, to make that information accessible and to start a broader public debate.
And also have some record of one's time there, and with this unique head and the guidance. Rebecca, your feelings around the project?
Yes, so the project in many regards is an extension of the work we were doing at JICS and a really meaningful compilation as well. In the book, one of our chapters deals with what prison oversight really is and what it should look like. And we talk about accountability and transparency. And that's exactly what we're trying to do in this book. We're trying to hold those who have power in how we deal with crime and punishment in South Africa accountable for their decision making and their policies, and at the same time shed a light on what we have experienced going into various prisons. And as Sohela said, it really is quite a harrowing and unique experience. We both clerked at the Constitutional Court beforehand, where you sort of removed from the public and you only engage with the public through the general office. And then shifting in and as aspiring lawyers, sort of going into the very depth of our prison system. And I think I know it's shaped, if I may, all my co-authors in many, many ways, but it's truly alarming, and I think inspires all of us to work harder and to do more.
What I really like about the book, and then kind of almost how Edwin has taken younger people under their wings, is that spirit of activism that came from the 80s and from the legal profession in terms of fighting apartheid in a way. There's a blueprint for this, how to hold people to account, and luckily our elders are still there to teach us. I keep feeling this when I read this book. But the book, prisons shape South African society. And South Africa sort of has had a history of colonialism, which had a particular kind of role for incarceration, and then apartheid, which we know very well, was absolutely brutal, where people were segregated into black and white, where there was 70 deaths in detention. The scale was huge of how the prisons operated back then. So could you sort of reflect on that legacy? Which, of course, Edwin and all our old stalwarts know about, because at some point, and the vast majority of South Africans have a criminal record. People always say, oh, I won't get a job, I've got a criminal record. And I say, no, we all got one, darling. We'll have to fight that law. But if you could perhaps speak to the changeover and what we intended with the white paper and what turned out to happen. I'm not sure which one of you feels more sort of, able to speak.
Marianne, as the old stalwart, which is a compliment that you've given me this morning, and I'm very happy to be an old stalwart. Marianne, we had such good intentions. As you say, apartheid was locked into place by prisons and police. And of course, so many of our leaders were in prison, and we resolved to do better, as we did in the Constitution. And the Constitution enshrines the right of every detained person to be detained in conditions of human dignity, compatible with human dignity. And we haven't entirely failed, like with a lot of the other promises in the Constitution. It's a wicked lie to say that the Constitution has entirely failed. We've achieved a lot. We would have been in a much worse position, maybe Uganda or Rwanda or Poland or Hungary. So what we did was we made a promise to ourselves, which we've partially kept, but in a large measure have broken. And part of the story, and I'm going to give over here to Rebecca and to Sohela, part of the story is the terrible wrong turn we took in 1998 under Johnny de Lange, who was the chair of the parliamentary committee under the Mandela first presidency, before Thabo Mbeki came in. And they made this terrible mistake of choosing sentence inflation, longer sentences, life sentences. We're not going to give our audience today a lot of stats, but this one is important. End of 1994, fewer than 500 people serving life sentences. 2025, 18,500. It's a shocking figure and an unnecessary figure. Instead of the hard work of building up crime intelligence, building up the SAP, building up the National Prosecuting Authority, under Zuma, whom you've already mentioned, all of those institutions were wrecked, and they have not been restored under the present presidency. So that's where we are. But the message of the book, and I know we're going to come to that later, and I'm going to stop here and give over. The message of the book is that this is remediable.
Yeah, in our book, we trace the history. We try to understand the function that prisons played in colonial times and in apartheid times, and we look at how prisons were reformed and developed post-apartheid. And what's really interesting and important to note is, as Justice Cameron has mentioned, we have great laws. We have what we call these Mandela-infused laws, whether it's the Correctional Services Act, aspects of the Criminal Procedure Act, the white paper, Marianne, you mentioned, are really good pieces of law and of policy. But what happened is we passed these laws in the early 90s, and then in the late 90s, we all became very scared of crime. And so it's a question mark whether there was, in fact, a post-apartheid crime wave, and we investigate that in our book. But what happened is we turned to a whole array of tough-on-crime policies, and one of them being what Justice Cameron mentioned, which is a minimum sentencing regime. And so what we effectively did is, on the one hand, have these really human rights-infused progressive laws treating inmates as human beings entitled to various conditions and treatment. But on the other hand, we increased sentences, made it tougher to get bail, tougher to get parole. And one of the key messages in our book, and it's a hard truth, and I think it's something that three of us have engaged and reckoned and grappled with, is that our tough on crime approach is not making us safer in South Africa. We cannot find a trend between incarcerating more and more people and our murder rate going down. And that's why, in many respects, we want this book to be a call to action. We can't keep going with tough on crime if it's not making us safer.
Well, I just need to intervene here because people are listening to you and are going to have I think, a knee-jerk response to that, as we often have had in South Africa, because, the crime wave that happens during a political transition, there was the scrapping of the death penalty, which many people just use as a lever to say that's why the crime wave kind of spilled over. And many people say no one's afraid of jail, the Constitution protects criminals. That argument started to surface, and we are quite cruel as South Africans when it comes to punishment, because we're all a bit violated and we know about violence. But then what we did, the language, the war on drugs, war on crime, coupled with what Justice Cameron's brought out, the sentence inflation and the growth in population, then we start looking to the USA for a model of incarceration, where prisons are the ultimate state power or embodiment of state power. How does that come about? What happens there? If you can tell us about that, and how we begin to import concepts like Supermax Because I think South Africans are hungry for punishment, but they also have members of family in prisons. You know, the large body of South Africans know that they've got a son sitting 6-7 months, you know, for the dacha, whatever. So it might be those who are not in jail who go, they must stay there. But the truth of it is this. So we go for the ultimate American model. Set that out for us. I'm not sure whether who feels strongest about that one.
Maybe I can start by speaking actually about the post-apartheid crime wave, because I think a lot of South Africans take it for granted that post-apartheid, as you say, with these liberal, progressive reforms, including to crime and justice, of course, crime increased. When we look at the figures in our book, we find that doesn't seem to be the case. It's true that at the time of transition, there was a lot of violence, and in particular, a lot of political violence and instability. But very soon after the transition to democracy, the murder rate, which is our most reliable indicator of crime, because it's not reliant on people reporting crime or their trust in the police. You find a body, you can pretty reliably tell when it's the result of murder. So our murder rate from 95 starts to decrease, and it continues to reliably decrease until 2011, at which point the trend reverses, and we're now back at around the numbers of murders that we were experiencing during our very violent transitional period, about 27,000 murders a year. And so we can speak about, and I'm sure Justice Cameron will want to speak more about what causes that reversal in terms of the gains we were making. But the point is that we were actually getting much safer just at the time that we decided to implement these very tough on crime reforms, because we were getting safer, but for many reasons we felt less safe. And there are plenty of reasons for that. One of the reasons was people had fears about the transition, about a Black majority government, about communism and democracy.
Everything.
Exactly.
I think also with both sides having epigenetic fear of each other. You know, Afrikaans South Africans thinking we're going to be killed, and Black South Africans thinking we're going to be dominated. We don't want this. So you've got all these people caught up in this fear. So it's very, very good to hear that the stats don't show that, which is really interesting.
Yes, and so what we do is we look to America and we look to the UK, and we import the war on drugs and the war on crime, which was a huge misstep, we think, because America, as we all know now, incarcerates more people than anyone in the world and disproportionately incarcerates poor Black men. We thought of America as a leader. We sent, for example, people to America to study super maximum security prisons. They came back inspired, decided to build one in every province in South Africa. Luckily,
I heard the word tender, or maybe not. No, not in this case. But who was this? Was this a policy change? Who made this decision?
so at the time, the department had a few reasons, the Department of Correctional Services had a few reasons for considering it. They were worried about increasing levels of escapes and violence in prisons and gang culture in prisons, which is a serious problem. And so that's the reason they give for considering super maximum security prisons. Fortunately, in our view, civil society, the South African Human Rights Commission were opposed to the idea of a supermax for every prison. And so we only have 2 super maximum security prisons built. And I guess for people in the audience wondering why we think that's a problem, is because these are prisons where people are kept in essentially permanent solitary confinement, which we think is cruel and degrading.
Marianne, can I come back to your question? Who was responsible? And the answer has to be given in class terms. The political elite, which includes Marianne Thamm and the 3 of us, the authors, and most of our participants in this seminar. We are the people who have mobiles, who can fly to Cape Town, if not abroad. We are the people. And Johnny Delanga and the Mandela Parliament instituted the misstep, and it was perpetuated under Thabo Mbeki. So the whole political elite and all of us, I was a judge at the time, first in the High Court and then in the Supreme Court of Appeal. I was also guilty. I gave judgments on minimum sentences. So all of us made this terrible mistake. And our book is not just aimed at the new political elite. It is also aimed at them. We hope we find a much wider readership because a wider readership is important. And by the way, Marianne, if I may be politically correct and correct your language, knee-jerk. I never say that people's anger about crime is knee-jerk. I'm respectful of their anger, their fears, and I'm also respectful of talion, Marianne, which is vengeance, wraakse. Dit so 'n mooi woord in Afrikaans en in Hollands ook.
Yeah.
So all of that just to say, Marianne, it was a collective mindset that brought us to where we are, and the collective mindset that also colluded in Jacob Zuma's destruction of the crime intelligence, which I think is even more important than his destruction of the police and his destruction of the NPA. All three institutions are still suffering from Jacob Zuma's first 2 or 3 years, which culminated in the appointment of a criminal, Mr. Richard Mdluli, to head crime intelligence. And since then, crime intelligence has been largely dysfunctional, largely collusive, I fear, with criminal syndicalism. And we can fix that, Marianne, but we need strong leadership. We need capable people to be appointed to the police, to prisons. I know that Sohela Sorajpal has been doing her best over the last few years with the NPA. She's struggled because a lot of the shady characters are still inside. And of course, we have to blame the current president for the fact that Mr. Chauke was only suspended a few weeks ago, 2 years after Sohela Sorajpal asked the president to suspend him because of shady issues. So long story, but I want to answer your question. It's our fault.
Well, it often is. And now I think American people might find out, the same way as we find out. We trusted our politicians. I just wanted perhaps either any of you to give this unbelievable, our prisons are overcrowded in 2015 already, but 115%. And you give us a few examples of just your personal experiences because you as the inspecting judge and your directorate go into these places. And I mean, the descriptions you give are, the solitary confinement, keeping people in solitary confinement, people lose their minds. You are able to set out for us the absolute horror of solitary confinement, the concept of it, and some of the conditions of other prisons. I'm not sure if I'd like the listeners and readers to actually hear some of what you witnessed, actually.
Please.
If you can just let us know there was one story you told us, which was, it's just incredible. I'm trying to remember where I read it because there's so many of young people committing suicide. In jail cells. And then, of course, that judgment by Judge Ellen Francis about kind of apartheid-style torture that had taken place. And that was at Kgosi-Mampuru, I think. So this is a very big issue.
But Rebecca and Sohela will fill us in on solitary confinement and the issue you've just raised.
So Marianne, I'm so glad that glad's not the right word. I'm rather pleased that these vivid stories stick with you, because that was one of our intentions with writing this book, was to really try in a respectful way bring to life what we saw and what we witnessed, and to share it with, as Justice Cameron says, all of us who are responsible. So maybe I'll talk a bit about eBongweni. As Sohela mentioned, we have 2 Supermax prisons in South Africa. eBongweni in Kokstad in KZN is one of them. And it was developed very inspired by American-style Supermax prisons. And I went into eBongweni, I think it was still during COVID, so all masked up, all social distancing, which is not a problem in a Supermax. But what happens is you walk through the prison, and unlike maybe your Sun City or your Westville or your Pollsmoor, it's quiet, it's eerie. There's pastel colors, the conditions are actually relatively pretty good, and that's because people aren't crowded together in a cell, but they are sitting isolated and we give the measurements in our book of how big their cells are, for about 23 hours a day, when that 1 hour to spare, they can go exercise in an exercise cage, and during our inspections we go see those cages as well. And so what would happen is we would go in, we would inspect, we would speak to some inmates, and the only way to engage with them most of the time would be through almost a post box, small space at their door. We would have to, I'm quite short myself, and I would have to even bend down to try engage with an inmate and make eye contact. And so we try in our book bring these these haunting experiences to life. And through these inspections and our reporting, we would engage with correctional officials who were quite relieved that we came to Ebongweni, because they themselves are seeing how inmates are, the psychological consequences of sitting alone 23 hours a day. So my co-authors can speak more to Ebongweni, to Mangaung, to CMAX and Kgosi, but it's these really harrowing experiences that we saw, where it's not your overcrowded cell. It's something quite different, but equally haunting and deeply problematic.
And then on the other side of the spectrum from complete isolation is gross overcrowding, which is the case in, I think, most of our prisons, and especially large urban prisons. So our prison system has capacity to accommodate about 107,000 people. It currently accommodates more than 160,000 people. So it is way over capacity. And in large urban centers, that's most prevalent. When we visited Durban Westville, we were walking into cells that we were being told were designed to accommodate between 20 to 30 men. And they were housing 60, 70, one cell had 81 men in a single cell. We as South Africans like to spread the myth that our prisons are like hotels, people are living lives of luxury, they have TVs. That's just not the case in the average prison. You walk into a cell that is the size of a small classroom, I would say, where you have bunk beds stacked sometimes 3 levels high. You have mattresses sometimes on the floor. People spend maybe 23 hours a day in that cell because the centers don't have enough staff to allow people out of their cells for regular exercise, and definitely not more than the 1 hour statutory minimum a day. They share a single toilet and a single shower, which, given our perennial water problems in our country, are often don't flush. There is almost never hot water. The lights don't work. There are exposed electrical wires. It's broken windows, mold on the ceilings and walls, peeling paint. Our infrastructure in our prisons is really in poor condition because of departmental dysfunction, but all of it is made worse by overcrowding, by the simple fact that we lock too many people up. And we don't think building more prisons will solve that problem, because around the world, when more prisons are built, courts and lawmakers find a way to fill those prisons. So our point is, if you want to deal with the really gross human cost of overcrowding, we have to be sending less people to prison, or at least sending more people to prison, but for shorter periods.
And then also, as you've all pointed out, people who are unable to pay bail and whose cases get postponed endlessly, who have not been charged, who have not been found guilty, and who then are not able to have the privileges that prisoners might have. Consentenced prisoners who would get food or books or some, be entered into some program in incarceration. So you've got large numbers of awaiting trial prisoners, some for minor offences. And this is where I think your book begins to look at ways, and you say this harks back to these earlier new legislations, these sentencings. And it's quite clear that many young people are not learning anything in jail. They're just learning how to become criminals, and that is kind of, if you want to perpetuate something, then, let's keep doing this.
Marianne, can I just say I know that amongst the 240 seminar participants, there are some Foucault fans, and that's what Foucault said. He said, prisons are the elite's way of creating a criminal class. Now, that's pushing it. I personally think it's pushing it, but it's an interesting concept And I want to come back to what Sohela has said. And I want to give one more stat. I don't think we're going to give any more. But Sohela and Rebecca did a rough calculus, and the statisticians can rightly shoot us down. They took the murder rate and they took the NPA figures and they did a rough calculation, and they came out in our book at saying that approximately 11% of those who commit murder are brought to justice and sentenced. The fact from that stat is that we are sending fewer and fewer offenders to jail for longer and longer. And that is where our prison system is failing. We understand people's rage and fear and anger. I'm not patronizing people who feel that, because I'm also scared at every street corner in Johannesburg. Should you open your window to a needy person? We all have those thoughts. So we are all on the edge of fear and rage. So it's a reality, but we have to find ways to deal with it. And the book says, start with crime intelligence. That's the way to tackle the criminal syndicates, the copper cable thieves, the extortionists, the kidnappings, the steel thefts, the underground mine workers. And the kingpins aren't the people who are being targeted. The desperately deprived people who go down the mines and who steal the copper cables. The kingpins may be in the cabinet, they may be MECs. We know that criminal syndicalism has spread very deep and very high in our country. Now, we need a reversion not just to the Scorpions, but to the Scorpions Plus to deal. And the Scorpions, we need a corruption-busting entity, as the Constitutional Court said in Glenister, and we need a resuscitation, a revival, a recreation of crime intelligence. Take it out of the hands of the shady people and put it into service to start combating crime. That would be effective, not this idea of locking up a handful of rapists for life and then we feel good. Oh, we're dealing with rape. No, we're not.
Correct. Rebecca, anything you wanted to add or put by? I mean, there's a question here I have also. You've written about the guards, the people who guard these incarcerated people, many of them in distress because just of the conditions anyway. You know, some of the prisons, there are drugs, some of them not, you know, but the guards, and we know, are public servants. And they risk their lives. And you described some prisons in the Eastern Cape where they actually don't have enough staff. So this is also this is a government issue as well. I mean, why are staff not equipped? Is it just general, you know, lack of concern or benign neglect?
So Marianne, I just wanted to underscore before turning to that question, the point about learning how to be a criminal once you're in prison. You may have been charged or accused of a relatively minor offense or a petty offense or a non-violent offense, but you go into our prison system, and with overcrowding and gangs, that's when you could become a hardened criminal. And so we talk about this idea of revolving doors, high recidivism rates, and prisons as universities of crime. And so our book then does take reform really seriously. Our most substantive, meaty chapter is looking at reforms. And I'm so pleased that Justice Cameron already highlighted the importance of crime intelligence. But Marianne, your point about correctional officials, I think two points I want to get across. Firstly, what our book tries to do is to show that things aren't all good and bad, black and white. Things are really nuanced and complex. So I think maybe it's through popular culture, through books. It can also be through experiences. You think all correctional officials are bad and all inmates are good. And based on our experiences going in, inspecting, interviewing, and engaging, things are a lot more complex. We have encountered some correctional officials who are really trying their best. This is a calling for them, and even through our book events, I think at one or two of our launches, some correctional officials have come and appreciated how our book tries to not shift the blame on them, but this collective problem. At the same time, we do have correctional officials who are corrupt. My co-authors can speak to, they've recently done some more investigations on how phones and TVs, how do those get through prisons? It's through corruption amongst correctional officials. So the first point I wanted to make, things are more nuanced. The second point I wanted to make is our prison walls are porous. We like to think, lock him up, throw away the key. But that's not how it works. Correctional officials are part of communities, public health issues, cultures of violence. And so what goes on behind prison walls impacts all of us every day, even if we don't see it. And so I think what correctional officials experience in prison impacts their communities and all of our communities.
And of
If I
course,
could add,
yes.
I often find it quite strange when you speak to a correctional official or a head of center, they will have views that are more progressive than any of us political leads, as Justice Cameron calls us. I was at Polsmoor last week, and the head of center there, or the area commissioner rather, who showed us around, he was distraught at the conditions there. He turned and looked at a group of judges who were inspecting the facility, and he said, how can we do this to our children? He was upset about unaffordable bail, about people accused of petty crimes who are sent to prison. And he made the point that prison could not be a solution to these kinds of problems. And he wasn't alone. I think we often meet officials who have these stunningly progressive views, and they have these views just because they have to day by day go into work and administer these inhumane conditions and know and care for inmates living in a really horrible place. They feel the effects acutely. And in fact, 2 years ago, JIX did a study at Ebongweni, one of our super maximum security prisons, on the mental health effects of solitary confinement. But we didn't just study the effects on inmates, we also studied the effects on the officials who have to administer this system. And what we found was that for both inmates and officials, were showing serious signs of trauma, depression, anxiety because of the conditions they're forced to live and work in. So you're absolutely right that this is a system that damages everyone within it, essentially.
So we're going to turn now towards possible sort of solutions. And as you say, a large part of your book is here talking about, practical prison reform. But before we get there, I just wanted to tell people, if they want another example, perhaps, and this isn't a private prison, is the Thabo Bester story. Everything about that story is just, it's unbelievable, but yet it's true. So these kind of things, and Justice Cameron was responsible for outing that. But I wanted to know from you, what powers does JIX have, let our readers know, in order to try and enforce change? And is that something that needs to be looked at? Because you can make recommendations and you can just get ignored.
Marianne, I'm in the role of correcting our interlocutor today. It wasn't me that brought it to light. It's Ground Up, your companion magazine.
I'm so sorry.
Yes.
Oh, yeah, sorry. Delete that.
Ground Up. But there is an answer to your question.
Right. So let's, what is the answer? Is do we need to change the legislation around JIX so that it becomes an independent oversight body, perhaps like the public protector or any of those other Chapter 9s? Is that possible?
Sohela?
Well, JIX is independent, and in fact, we recently won our independence. The Constitutional Court ordered that we must be separated from the department that we oversee, because there was no way that we'd be being a part of the department and having the department control our budget that we could genuinely be independent. So the court ordered that the statute be amended to provide for our financial and operational independence. And that happened from April last year. We became a fully independent, we were called a national government component. So we're an entity separate from the department. Of course, we still have challenges. And one of the challenges we have is that our recommendations are not binding. So as you say, we can make a report, we can make recommendations, and the department is not obliged to follow through and to implement. What we are doing is working on a JIX bill. So this would be a sort of standalone empowering legislation, and it has the support of the department who we've been working very closely with. We're ironing out some final issues before it's introduced to cabinet and then parliament. And what we've decided to do there is strike a sort of middle ground. We're not saying that every single one of our recommendations or findings are binding, because we understand that there might be factors, there might be information that we don't have access to that might make our recommendations impossible or unwise. But what we say is that the department must implement our findings and recommendations. If they do not, they must give us reasons for not doing so. And of course, those reasons could be challenged as being unreasonable or unjustifiable. We think that strikes a good middle ground, and it would empower us. And the amendment and the bill also do other things to expand our powers, our reporting areas. So we, I think, are on track towards being a more empowered oversight body, and we're certainly part of the way there now.
Well, thanks to our courts again for that. I often remind South Africans they forget just how much of a guardrail our courts actually are. All right, let's just move a little bit towards, okay, what can we do immediately to halt this terrible vicious cycle? What are the proposals?
So as our book maps out various options, and as we say, there's short-term, medium-term, long-term reforms that can be done sequentially, simultaneously. But before I mention a few, I just wanted to underscore the problem we have here. Our prisons, on the one hand, are over-inclusive. We are incarcerating too many people. We have too many awaiting trial detainees. Around 30 to 40% of those in our prisons are awaiting trial. They've been accused of a crime, not yet found guilty. And they await, they can await trial from 4 days to 4 years. So you have too many people. Then you also have an under-inclusive problem where, as I think Justice Cameron had alluded to already, some of the kingpins, some of the people in our government who are really calling the shots on organized crime are not actually sitting in our prisons. And so our chapter on reform and our book in many respects is not a book of doom and gloom. It's a book of hope, a wake-up call to be proactive. And so we look at reforms both inside our prisons and outside our prisons. And some of the reforms outside our prisons that we can do is what Justice Cameron mentioned with effective crime intelligence. There's also something you mentioned, Marianne, is South Africans know violence, or we just sort of accept this culture of violence. I think that is something we need to take seriously. How can young people grow up in this country without experiences of violence, without intergenerational violence, without seeing that we need accountability, yes, but not violence. So I think there's a different, almost like a social cultural shift that needs to happen. We need more jobs. We need more opportunities. Then within our prisons, we think very seriously about ways that we can improve treatment and conditions. And to tie this into our discussion, how if our prisons are overcrowded in bad conditions, it perpetuates people's tendencies towards crime. And so we look at various options of how to improve. We also talk about, and I want to hand over to my co-authors because there are so many different reforms that we speak about. But the one reform we look at, and Marianne, maybe this is a reform that could hopefully be implemented quite soon, is this idea of a bail fund. As I mentioned, 30 to 40% of our prison population are awaiting trial. Of some of those, some people are merely in our waiting trial centers, waiting for trial just because they can't afford bail of around 1,000 rand or less. So a judge has considered their bail application, says that bail is permitted, but they cannot afford it. And so what we would like is to have the political elite, if I may, come together, pull some funds and say, for that person who perhaps is accused of a drug offense, possession of certain drugs, I'll put up that 400 rand bail in the hope that what gets them to their trial isn't money, isn't their social standing or their social class, but rather some positive nudges towards jobs, towards substance reliance programs. So we really try to think outside the box in innovative ways, in evidence-based ways, and in a hope that this is respecting people's human rights, but also trying to deter crime. And the last thing I'll say before I pass on to my co-authors is our book takes what inmates and what perpetrators of crime do seriously, but we do it because we care a lot about survivors and victims of crime, and we want to stop the cycle of violence and crime in South Africa.
Can I put a quick footnote,
Yes.
Marianne?
Yes.
And of course, you were not going to ask us about Minister Dr. Pieter Groenewald.
I was
But
going to
we
at
are
the
going to
end, man.
introduce it.
No, man,
We are
we've
going
got
to-
no, Nkazi, we've got questions coming in. Of course, we've got questions.
But hold
Nkazi
on a
was
sec,
watching.
Marianne. I just want to
Yes,
say
sure.
what Rebecca has just said explains why we cannot go back to blikseming and donnering people. We cannot. The minister is right to raise the issue, because what is worse, blikseming a young guy with a cat o' nine tails, as we did under apartheid, we did under the Dutch Far East centuries ago, or the overcrowded. It's a real debate, but we think that for the reasons Rebecca has given, we cannot inflict more violence in our prison system. Thank you. That was just a foot.
No, that's absolutely important. And now, yeah, I mean, many of the questions coming in from those who are watching, thank you very much. Mike is asking, which we can talk to now, with such overcrowding, again, is there any chance for rehabilitation? And then we have Nkazi asking an interesting question. In efforts to rehabilitate prisoners and create opportunities for offenders, should skills training such as bricklaying or other trades that contribute to infrastructure development also be part of the solution? Now, there are already, I think, sentenced young people who are part of programs, who are getting degrees, and we see some of them coming into life without the shame, but with having been given an opportunity in jail to rehabilitate. Wayne is asking, ex-offenders are still behind bars even if they're released with criminal records. He says the presidential pardons are not granted. Can the tools that built the master's house be used to dismantle it? So let's stop with those two there. The bricklaying, now in comes Pieter, Papa, as otherwise known in the Cape. Papa wag vir jou. Starting a bakery, starting a vegetable garden. I mean, we are all very happy to see this. Give us your opinion on Pieter and what he's doing.
My two co-authors are far less tactful than I am as a former judge, so I'm going to leave it to them.
I wanted us to talk a little bit about the food as well, especially. I mean, whether there would be egg mayonnaise sandwiches served at supper or anywhere else.
Good question.
So let me start by speaking about work and rehabilitation and skills training. It's true that that's something Minister Groenewald has prioritized. I think it's been a priority of the department long before he joined, and there've always been work programs in place, as well as rehabilitation education programs. One of the problems is that there just isn't enough access to those programs. You're right to say, firstly, that people awaiting trial don't have access to those programs. Why would you be rehabilitated when you haven't been found guilty of anything yet? So it's only sentenced prisoners, and Ground Up recently published an article that said only about 7% of sentenced inmates have access to work and skills training programs. So that's a tiny proportion. And it's just because there aren't enough resources to go around. So, for example, we were told when we visited a youth center in KZN, Ekuseni, we were shown this really lovely workshop that they had, which they told us was full of equipment, and they were ready to teach the young men and boys there woodworking and welding. But all of the TVET programs in the region had been shut down because there weren't enough officials who were skilled enough to handle that training, to teach people how to weld or to do woodworking. Sometimes there just aren't enough resources. You don't have enough welding rods. You don't have fabric. One way people can really be involved is by donating those resources. So when we visited Durban Correctional Center, besides the egregious overcrowding, we were shown something that was quite positive, this wonderful hall where people were learning to sew, to make furniture, to make art. They didn't have someone training them. The inmates were teaching one another, were figuring things out. And we were told by one of the officials there that the fabric that they were using to sew had been donated by members of the community, by local business owners. And the head told us that violence levels at the prison had decreased when they introduced these training and arts programs, because now inmates actually had something productive and affirming and useful to do with their time. So we're big advocates. You asked us about the practical reforms we'd suggest. One of those reforms must be more education, training, rehabilitation programs, more access to psychologists, to social workers. There are perennial shortages of those skilled professionals in our system. I don't know if Rebecca wants to say anything about food and egg and mayonnaise sandwiches, but our general...
I'd like to come in too.
Yes.
May I, Rebecca? I just
Yeah.
want to say that we went to Ekuseni, and it was a sad place because of the youngsters who were there. They allowed youngsters, and still up to 25, to stay, even though it's officially up to 21. But they allowed some of the reason why people don't want to go to Ekuseni is that there's no smoking there, no cigarette smuggling. But I want to say something about that wonderful, huge workshop. I think it's misallocation of resources. We've got enough prisons budget, but are we concentrating it on head office personnel, or are we spending it on welding rods? We went to a welding facility where the guy told us, I haven't got any supply of welding rods. I think that the undercurrent from Mr. Dladla and Mr. Janse van Rensburg, who run Ekuseni very well, almost like in a Siya Kolisi and Ibn Etzebeth partnership, I think the undercurrent, and they didn't say this, meneer van Rensburg, ek sê nie dat u dit gesê het nie, but the undercurrent was that they could have kept that open. The provincial commissioner, I think it was Mr. Nsele, let us name names, closed that workshop down. I think a reallocation of resources could have kept it open with all the benefits that Sohela has just mentioned. Thank you for letting me interrupt. Rebecca was about to say something.
Yes, I think I spoke quite a bit about the different reforms, but I think it's that problem where we have quite a substantial, if I can echo Justice Cameron here, we have quite a substantial prison budget, but what are we spending that budget on? One of the issues we even experienced is, I think it was in Grootvlei, where we identified that certain inmates were contracting chickenpox. And this, as you know, is quite dangerous when you're especially an adult. And what we uncovered was that it was because of the lack of clean uniforms, clean bedding. I am under the impression that the chickenpox is now under control. But the reason I bring it in here is to show you that we have inmates that could acquire skills, could assist with some of the sewing of uniforms for a reasonable wage, could assist with learning skills with plumbing, etc. But what has happened is through state capture and Bosasa, and a lot that I've learned from following the Daily Maverick, is that we've sort of distorted our budget and what gets spent and what gets prioritized. Why not take a group of people who are behind bars, serving their sentence, and give them opportunities to actually improve themselves. When they come out, they have skills.
Absolutely. And I mean, also perhaps volunteers. South Africa has a great history of some retired people, somebody sitting somewhere would love to teach people how to weld, because, you know, pensioners also need things to do. So, and we are such a country full of volunteers, people serving, and already people are doing things in jail. We've got a few minutes left. There's a very good question to, you know, where we get. Also, people come to the gathering, which is happening on the 28th of August at the CTICC, Cape Town International Conference Center. It's so many T's and C's there. But before we go, Ingrid Papp asks, given the widespread belief in deterrence and in harsher punishments, being sort of a solution to violent crime, will we ever have the sufficient political will to affect these reforms and humane and more humane conditions? I love that last question, because just how it was framed indicates again an understanding. We need humane conditions. So what's the possibilities of this? I mean, it's there. We can do it. We must just action it. Where's the political will? Well, Pieter Groenewald's there in the bakery.
He is, and he's a tough guy, and he wants to get things done. We differ from him on mooring people, and we differ from him on the regularity with which he's giving lifers parole, 18,500 lifers. So we don't agree, but he's an action-oriented, serious-minded person, and we're grateful for all of that. But Marianne, of course, it's a question of moving the elite. Our book, wants to change minds and insights, not just in the elite, but more generally. And we can do that. And but I like to bring in the co-authors who, as I said at the beginning, wrote most of the book.
Well, I think it's great that we've mentioned deterrence, because when we think of long sentences and harsh bail or parole approaches, we tend to justify them in terms of deterrence. This will stop people from doing crime. But what research in practically every country shows is that it's not the nature of the punishment or the length of the sentence that deters crime. It's rather the certainty of punishment. So someone about to commit a crime isn't thinking, oh, I'm going to get 10 years instead of 5 years for this crime. I better not do it. They're thinking, I probably won't get caught. And even if I did, I don't really know what the punishment for it is anyway. And like Justice Cameron said, in our country, because of how weak crime intelligence and detective work and prosecuting is, if someone thought they weren't going to be punished for committing a crime, they'd probably be right. So if we actually want to deter people, our focus shouldn't be on harsher sentences and harsher punishments, but rather a more effective criminal justice system. And then, of course, actually addressing the socioeconomic circumstances that lead to crime, because it's you can't avoid the fact that in our country, a large degree of crime is driven by the social and economic circumstances that people exist in.
And also just the shame, also, that families carry, and that sometimes this also, just goes through generations and generations. We've got a few minutes left only. I'm just holding up the book again for everyone. It is available at the Daily Maverick bookshop. And I highly recommend it, just in terms of giving yourself, if you live particularly in Tokai, I would like you to read this. And if you live in an estate there, it's interesting that you can split your world this way. Thank you very much to Edwin co-authors for this lovely webinar, and very insightful, very important discussion. And pleased that in South Africa, we actually can have such a discussion and agree on the human rights. And that's why I have to keep saying I absolutely love us. So thank you to all of you for your time this afternoon, all of those of you who've sent questions and tuned in. Great. We'll see you again at the next one. And thank you very much.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. What a pleasure. Thanks, Marianne.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Bye.